What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? Story 1. As part of the Army and CIA's experiments into mind control, they put electrodes into pleasure centers of dogs' brains. Initially, they wanted hundreds of dogs. They only actually got 10, and of those, only a few were implanted. The ones which were would be remote controlled by zapping them and essentially giving them a dose of dopamine when they were facing the right direction. The controllers would stop the dope zap when they wanted the dogs to stop, and then the dogs would reorient themselves until they were facing the correct direction. This meant when the controllers weren't present, the dogs who had been implanted would continually spin in circles, even in their cages, always looking for the direction that gave them the next hit. The program ran out of funding in the mid-60s, and the dogs were destroyed. If you want to read all about it and other things that the US and governments around the world are up to from the horse's mouth, I recommend theblackvault.com, the website of Black Vault. Here's 100-ish pages of what I described above, helpfully FOIA'd and archived thanks to his hard work, theblackvault.com. Edit. For some bright side, via the same source, we get remote control of war dogs, remotely controlled scout dog, June 1974, wherein we learn that we can just train dogs. They respond to audio and visual cues, and can be trained to turn on command at long distances by playing a tone over the radio. That one is really creepy. It also seems highly unnecessary. Dogs are really willing to follow our commands once you train them correctly. Why would there be a need to put electrodes in their brains to make them do what you want them to? Hopefully, this didn't mean that the government was trying to move on to human experiments after success with the dogs. That kind of thing already exists for humans. It's called TikTok. Story 2. My hometown was littered with radioactive waste by the federal government as part of the Manhattan Project, nytimes.com. Then we wonder why cancer and thyroid conditions are the norm. I grew up 2 miles from the LOW, Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bring in 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick. They acted like they knew nothing. Eventually, people sued, and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site. I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the elements, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site but was never used and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. I wonder if anyone has ever had to move here. I wonder if anyone knew what the situation was with the cancerous chemicals on the site and they still moved there anyway because they couldn't afford to be anywhere else. I wonder what the prices are like in that area. I also wonder if there's any type of research into new kinds of materials that can better contain these kinds of hazardous waste. Story 3. When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were unalived instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school, and pretty much there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures even after it was obvious stuff hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate. They died astronauts. That's something to be admired, in my opinion. I remember watching the space shuttle live. I remember seeing the explosion live. It was a shock to everyone. I remember we were all being told that they died instantly. It is a shock to realize that they were still alive before they hit the water. That is really tragic, and yet they still died doing their duty. Story 4. After the My Lai massacre, unaliving of around 400 to 500 innocent civilians in Vietnam after an army troop unalived an entire village, the U.S. government established a group to investigate other war crimes like this occurring in Vietnam, the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group. They found 28 massacres of equal or greater magnitude than My Lai that the public was unaware of, so literally thousands of innocent people unalived by U.S. soldiers. The information has since been reclassified, but there were several journal articles on it when it was first released. I took a military ethics class hosted by a prof who spent many years in Vietnam as a Marine captain. He personally experienced a colonel who operated with a doctrine called count the meat. Basically, the success of an operation was dependent on how many bodies it made. The presumption was that they were all enemies. Story 5. One that is not us. There was an episode of Radiolab that talks about an enormous secret facility in Britain that houses the British Empire's secret archives. The way they describe it, it sounds like the place where the Ark of the Covenant is stored at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. What they uncover in the episode is the human rights atrocities that were committed by British troops during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya during the 1950s. There were details in the uncovered documents about detention camps and torture that occurred during the conflict. It gave grounds for surviving Mau Mau to seek compensation against the Crown in recent years. The atrocities of the conflict were not widely known until recently. wnyc.studios.org. Story 6. MKUltra. Partially illegal, forced mind control experiments using psychoactive substances, conducted by the CIA in the 1950s and 60s. More specifically, the death of Frank Olson. Olson was going to expose Project MKUltra. Olson was a CIA employee who was dosed with LSD by his superior and then committed self-unaliving 9 days later by jumping out of his hotel window. After an autopsy, there was some evidence found that he was unconscious when he plunged out of the window. Wikipedia.org. Ironically, MKUltra is one of the more popular of the secret government projects. Heck, we've even made movies about it. I don't mean documentaries. We've made full-on movies about them. A lot of them poke fun at that kind of thing. It's a bit creepy to talk about someone who seems to have self-unalived, but it turns out there was possibly no way they could have been alive when it happened. You don't want to think our government is capable of such cruelty. Story 7. Two things come to mind. I think they're called the Pentagon Papers. They detail how America went into Vietnam with no intention of winning, rather to control China and that part of the world. Not creepy, but potentially creepy as the JFK assassination papers that get released in October. I'm looking forward to that day. Edit. Spelling. Story 8. New Zealand's UFO files are a bit creepy. I was in the library and stumbled across the bound files. There's a lot of assumed crazy people being crazy, but there's also one specific one that stood out from respectable Air Force pilots who were both in the air, conducted mini-tests, e.g. blinking, moving the plane in relation to the object, verifying what he saw with the co-pilot to ensure it wasn't an illusion or his mind. I don't know, just the fact that you'd assume he wasn't crazy creeps me out so much. Story 9. Canadian here, the Somalia affair. Not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember when your country does something bad, it's not always the bad guys who can be freaking evil. It's one thing to realize that the United States government can do some pretty bad things. You don't expect that the Canadian government could be something like this. We all have our jokes about how friendly Canadians are and how polite they are. It's more shocking to realize that they can be just as bad as any other government power. Story 10. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents that Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. Story 11. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against U.S. civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. Story 12. Devil Eyes, the plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings. Basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. Worst collectible ever. Who's that Pokemon? It's Devil Eyes Osama bin Laden. So basically, the government was planning a scare tactic along the lines of like Five Nights at Freddy's or Bendy or something like that. Story 13. Surprised no one has mentioned the Panama Papers. They've been out for a while, but there's been little coverage of them. Too long didn't read of them? Lots of money laundering that was tracked pointed to major governments and global businesses. Edit. Amazon Prime has a series called The Giant Beast That Is the Global Economy. They talk about the Panama Papers in a couple of episodes. Story 14. Project Sunshine, where the U.S. government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. Story 15. Jeffrey Dahmer's full confession, a couple of 100 pages of pure madness. Necrophilia, dismemberment, skinning, lobotomy, body part preservation, cannibalism. Dahmer became pretty close to his interrogating detectives, Dennis Murphy and Patrick Kennedy, and provided a lot of detail to them, a lot of it in a pretty candid offhand manner. And this is the guy we make Netflix series about. The thing is, I'm pretty sure a lot of comedians have made a lot of jokes about Dahmer. However, I think that no matter how outlandish a comedian will go overboard to try and make a joke, it sounds like they're probably dead-on accurate with Dahmer's behavior. I don't think I'd care to see a comparison of the two. Story 16. One U.S. bomber accidentally dropped a nuclear bomb a short distance from a major U.S. city. Can't remember which, but luckily it didn't detonate. Off the coast of Georgia. They still haven't found it. Operation Midnight Climax. The government hired spicy workers to dose Johns with LSD for research purposes, so to speak. Story 17. The Department of Health and Human Services practiced female sterilization on Native American women all the way through the 1970s. Kinda sobering knowing that we were using tax dollars to suppress indigenous birth rates less than 50 years ago. Wikipedia.org. Story 18. Can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. That is scary. It was scary enough that nuclear bombs were detonated in the first place. The fact that Hitler was trying to push for nuclear explosives as well is really frightening. It's like one of those alt history shows that shows what could have been if the Nazis had the bomb. That's frightening. Story 19. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Maralinga. Oh yeah, some Aboriginals live nearby. AustralianMap.net. Story 20. Not declassified, but leaked. Operation Yellowhammer. The government tried to say it was old, but it had an August date on it. Story 21. CIA involvement in starting the Guatemalan Civil War, which lasted 36 years and led to the unaliving of hundreds of thousands of indigenous people. CIA.gov. Declassified on CIA's own website? Kind of a bold move on CIA's part. I think we've just recently started to question what the US's role in the world should actually be. I think a lot of us would question whether we should really be involved at all. Story 22. There were over 50 mishaps with nuclear weapons by the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s alone. Story 23. The Nixon administration had a speech prepared for if the moon landing had failed, and it's chilling. I've read about this one before. It was only recently declassified. Nixon had instructions to personally call the what would have been widows of the astronauts should the thing failed before giving the speech. This is another instance where it looks like we're looking into an alternate history. I'm surprised that now someone hasn't done an impersonation of Nixon or done an AI clone voice of him reading that speech. That would be even more chilling. Story 24. We are planning to cut all homeless people in half in 2025. The UK government. Story 25. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Story 26. The CIA invested millions in trying to make cat spies. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.